From Tunisia to Syria, the people of the Arab nations are demanding political change, better economic opportunity, and a greater say in determining their future. As repressive regimes crumble under popular pressure or respond with violence against their own people, the international community has responded nimbly, seeking to address each distinct situation in a tailored approach that best supports the transition to responsible representative democracy. In previous decades, it would have been unheard of for a Treasury official to be here at the Washington Institute talking about the U.S. government's and the international community's response to these types of events. Yet throughout the Arab Spring, the Treasury Department has been at the forefront of the international community's response to these challenges on two fronts. Treasury has, of course, as we always have, been at the center of U.S. efforts to marshal international assistance and support for the transitions underway in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and to aid in fostering inclusive economic growth in the region. But today, what I'd like to focus on is the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, my office, which has crafted strategies for applying sanctions and other financial measures tailored to the unique circumstances of each situation we have faced. Along with the United States, the UN, the EU, and our partners in the Arab world and Middle East have all increasingly turned to targeted financial sanctions in response to repression and violence. And in a truly remarkable development, both the Arab League and Turkey have in recent days announced far-reaching measures of their own, making financial pressure the centerpiece of their respective efforts to end the bloodshed in Syria. But before I talk directly about the Arab Spring, I'd like to step back and offer some context in which we in Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence view these events. We have witnessed a dramatic change globally in the way financial measures are integrated into the international security toolkit. And these developments, the international community's embrace of targeted financial measures and the effectiveness of those measures, are to a large extent the result of Treasury Department's efforts over the past decade to create an institutional framework and to develop a strategic model for using financial tools to advance national security objectives. Within the Treasury Department, the mission of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, known as TFI, is to marshal the Treasury Department's policy, enforcement, regulatory, and intelligence functions to sever the lines of financial support to international terrorists, WMD proliferators, narcotics traffickers, and other threats to our national security. We seek to meet this responsibility by striving to achieve two overarching goals. First, to promote financial transparency by identifying and eliminating vulnerabilities that make the domestic and global financial system susceptible to abuse by illicit actors. And second, to identify, disrupt, and dismantle the financial networks that support those who threaten U.S. and international security. Promoting financial transparency is the key to creating a rules-based global financial system that is hostile to illicit finance. Our efforts focus on both the formal and informal financial sectors in both the U.S. and internationally. Indeed, a great deal of our work is aimed at strengthening global standards and facilitating implementation of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regimes, also known as AML-CFT, in countries around the world through multilateral organizations such as the Financial Action Task Force. In conjunction with our effort to promote financial transparency through global AML-CFT architecture, we've also developed a strategic approach to target the financial networks of those who support terrorists, engage in WMD proliferation, and foment regional instability. This approach combines unilateral and multilateral measures, often but not always built on UN Security Council resolutions, and consistent outreach to and dialogue with the private sector, what I call our strategic dialogue with the international financial sector. We began to put this strategy to the test in 2005 and 2006 against North Korea and Iran, respectively. Beginning with unilateral targeted financial measures, we launched an unprecedented effort to engage the private sector and raise its awareness of the risks of doing business with these jurisdictions. And most important, we engage with our international partners to build a multilateral coalition that supports our strategy of financial isolation. Today, the result of this multilateral, multi-year campaign in Iran and North Korea today, as a result of this multi-front, multi-year campaign, Iran and North Korea have been almost entirely cut off from much of the world's largest financial sectors. Iranian banks have been deprived of much-needed access to financial services in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Iranian government struggles to manage its economy in the face of ever-tightening financial sanctions. These two case studies demonstrated that we could craft financial strategies tailored to the unique circumstances presented by particular international security challenges. The success of our targeted measures was linked in no small part to the less public, but no less significant systemic work of promoting financial transparency and building AML-CFT regulatory regimes. And the work that we did in both areas, targeted and systemic, laid the groundwork for the international community's response to the Arab Spring, which I'll now turn my attention to, and start off with Tunisia and Egypt. In the early days of the Arab Spring, we witnessed the rapid growth of popular movements calling for the ouster of undemocratic rulers in Tunisia and Egypt. These popular movements were able to achieve relatively quick leadership changes. In this scenario, our goal was to ensure that the outgoing regime elites did not undermine the political transition by looting their nation's treasuries. To achieve this, we engaged our interagency and international partners to apply a comprehensive anti-corruption strategy to identify illicit holdings, protect against illicit asset flows, and assist in repatriating assets stolen from the people of Tunisia and Egypt. The strategy relied on and benefited from our prior experience in leading global efforts to trace and repatriate Iraqi assets stolen by the former Hussein regime, as well as long-standing efforts to create a global framework for combating kleptocratic asset flows. And again, the strategy also relies upon our long-standing efforts to develop a global framework for the implementation of AML-CFT standards, which includes a focus on specific risks of foreign corruption, such as highlighting the need for financial institutions to apply enhanced due diligence against foreign politically exposed persons and to recognize the potential for asset flight on behalf of deposed regimes. Our strategy also includes supporting the efforts of the Justice Department to confiscate and repatriate stolen assets, including by working with the joint World Bank and UN Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative, or the STAR Initiative, which provides critical assistance to countries that require technical assistance in understanding how to engage the international financial system to recover stolen assets stolen by corrupt elites. And it includes supporting the efforts of the State Department to strengthen the global commitment to developing and implementing a comprehensive anti-corruption regime through a variety of means, including the UN Convention Against Corruption, the OECD's anti-bribery working groups, and the G20's kleptocracy working group. In the cases of Tunisia and Egypt, Treasury alerted the international financial sector of the possibility of large-scale embezzlement on the part of the ousted leaders and their close associates. In both cases, the Treasury Department issued advisories to warn U.S. financial institutions of the possibility of asset flight by senior Egyptian and Tunisian government officials. The advisories called for enhanced due diligence and scrutiny of transactions that could possibly represent misappropriated or stolen state assets. Treasury shared its advisories with counterparts in other financial centers, many of which took similar actions, globalizing the effort to identify, restrain, and repatriate the proceeds of corruption. In the case of Libya, we faced a fundamentally different challenge. Our primary goal was not to prevent an ousted regime from looting the nation's coffer, but rather to deprive a sitting regime of the resources it needed to sustain a campaign of violent repression. Our aim was to increase the financial pressure on the Gaddafi regime and hasten its downfall. As we deployed our financial tools to isolate the Gaddafi regime, we were fortunate to be dealing with an unusually favorable set of circumstances from a sanctions perspective. We had broad international support for sanctions, a strong mandate from the UN Security Council, and a NATO-backed military effort. Following closely on the heels of President Obama's issuance of Executive Order 13566, we imposing broad financial and other sanctions. The U.S. and its partners secured the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1970, which required all UN member states to freeze without delay the assets of Gaddafi, his family, and key individuals and entities affiliated with the regime, and to prohibit transactions with them. The effect of these measures was magnified by the fact that the Gaddafi regime was relatively well integrated into the international financial system, with a large amount of wealth held in foreign holdings and investments susceptible to application of sanctions under U.S. and European jurisdiction. Just 3 days after President Obama issued the executive order, more than $30 billion of government of Libya assets had been frozen under U.S. jurisdiction. Since March, this total has swelled to more than $37 billion. This combination of factors, speed, coordination, and comprehensiveness, led to the implementation of one of the most successful sanctions regimes ever put in place. In reacting so quickly to the events unfolding in Libya, the international community safeguarded the wealth of the Libyan people from misappropriation by Gaddafi and prevented him from accessing a massive war chest to fund new violence. At the same time, the ban on transactions in business with the Gaddafi regime isolated it from the global financial system and key trading partners, restricting its ability to obtain desperately needed goods and services at crucial junctures in the conflict. These sanctions ultimately helped hasten the collapse of Gaddafi by preventing him from accessing the financial resources and channels of commerce necessary to purchase weapons, pay mercenaries, and fuel tanks and planes. The implementation of financial sanctions against Libya was not, of course, without its challenges. The principal challenge we faced in this context was facilitating and coordinating the effective implementation of sanctions and a sophisticated global financial system where the assets of concern were largely held in complex capital market arrangements across multiple financial centers. Treasury's expertise in implementing targeted financial sanctions and its relationships with the private sector and with international counterparts were instrumental in ensuring effective global action. And although the sanctions regime contributed to our initial policy goals, our work is far from finished. As articulated in Security Council Resolution 2009, we must now turn our attention to making blocked assets available transparently and responsibly in a manner consistent with the wishes and needs of the Libyan people. Doing so will require significant coordination among nations holding frozen assets and the new Libyan government. We look forward to the day when we will responsibly turn over the Gaddafi regime's frozen assets to and for the benefit of the Libyan people. Syria presents a more complicated set of challenges. In Syria, our policy goals are largely the same as in Libya, to deprive the Assad regime of access to resources that can be used to fund its violent oppression and ultimately to hasten Assad's downfall. However, in the case of Syria, our challenge has been to develop and advance a strategy to apply financial pressure to the Assad regime in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution. Such a strategy must combine effective unilateral action with strategic outreach to international counterparts in the private sector. Since the start of the uprising, the U.S. has led through example in achieving a significant multilateral increase in pressure on the Syrian government to stop its campaign of violence against its own civilians. Though the U.S. has sought to use sanctions to shift the behavior of the Syrian regime and its insiders long before the beginning of the uprising in March 2011, we have imposed a series of new measures in recent months that are designed to ratchet up pressure on the Syrian government. President Obama has signed 3 new executive orders since March, each serving as a response to Assad's escalation of violence. Executive Order 13572 targets individuals and entities responsible for human rights abuses in Syria. EO 13573 expands this further by targeting President Assad and other senior regime officials. And in August, the administration took the strongest step yet with Executive Order 13582, which prohibits transactions between U.S. persons and the government of Syria, bans the export of U.S. services to a new investment in Syria, and targets a crucial revenue stream for the Syrian government by banning all dealings with U.S. persons in Syrian origin petroleum products. In addition to these new measures, we continue to hold Syria accountable for all of its illicit behavior and took the important step of designating the Commercial Bank of Syria as a supporter of WMD proliferation under our WMD Executive Order 13382. These domestic measures have helped to deny the Assad regime access to the resources it needs to continue financing its repression. But the defining element of our Syria strategy, and what has made our strategy effective, has been our close coordination with our partners in Europe and elsewhere, and our aggressive outreach to expand the coalition of countries willing to take complementary action. When President Obama announced the government blocking program under EO 13582 and called for Assad to step down on August 18th, many of our international counterparts echoed his call. A number of these countries, including Japan, Australia, Switzerland, and Canada, have issued sanctions of their own against Syria. Most notably, the EU implemented a ban on the importation of Syrian oil and gas and prohibited new investment in the Syrian energy sector. Furthermore, following the U.S. designation of the Commercial Bank of Syria for its proliferation activity, the EU froze Commercial Bank of Syria assets in Europe. And this week, the EU announced the decision to implement new measures against Syria's energy, financial, and trade sectors, including listing additional individuals and entities that are involved in the violence or directly supporting the Assad regime. Without question, U.S. and EU financial measures have successfully undermined the financial underpinnings of the Assad regime. Our actions against the Commercial Bank of Syria have helped to constrain the Assad regime's primary facilitator of foreign transactions. More importantly, since the EU previously accounted for more than 90% of Syria's crude exports, U.S., EU, and Canadian sanctions against the Syrian petroleum industry have effectively eliminated the Assad regime's revenue from the petroleum sector, which accounted for 1/3 of its total revenue prior to the imposition of sanctions. Additionally, It's difficult to overstate the importance of the Arab League's and the Turkish government's unprecedented decisions earlier this week to implement wide-ranging sanctions against the Syrian government. The Arab League's resolution includes a full slate of aggressive financial measures that include calling on member states to cease transactions with the Central Bank of Syria and the Commercial Bank of Syria. The Turkish government also announced a similarly strong set of measures that include freezing all Syrian government assets and prohibiting dealings with the Syrian Central Bank. Taken together, the Arab League's and Turkey's announcement of sanctions represents a significant step on the road towards ending the bloodshed in Syria. We have arrived at this current state of affairs in no small part because of the U.S. government's persistent engagement with its foreign partners. The Treasury Department has played a leading role in emphasizing the power of financial measures, in particular in the Syrian context. In recent months, senior Treasury officials have traveled extensively to places like Turkey and the Gulf to deliver the same message. We recognize that the Assad regime will continue to use the international financial system to attempt to evade sanctions. Coordinated multilateral action is therefore critically important to identifying and disrupting potential areas for Syrian government to evade sanctions. Equally important are strategic dialogue with the international private sector, particularly in regional financial centers that are potential destinations for the Assad regime's assets. In the past month, I've traveled to Lebanon and Jordan to engage with public sector officials and caution financial institutions to exercise vigilance against potential sanctions evasion. We will continue to encourage all of our partners around the world to move without delay to increase the pressure on the Syrian government through targeted financial measures in the hopes of bringing an end to the violence in Syria and pushing for Assad to step down to allow for a peaceful and democratic transition. Just yesterday, we announced the designation of 2 new Syrian individuals and the identification of a public works company called Military Housing Establishment, which provides funding to the regime, and Real Estate Bank, which is Syria's second largest bank. And the administration will continue its efforts to press for a resolution at the UN that will help to further isolate the current Syrian government. So in conclusion, as we continue to respond to developments in the Arab world, we stand ready to take action where needed, and we will be ready to apply financial measures in support of our national interests. We continue to witness the uncertainty of a tumultuous historic time. However, one thing is certain: financial tools will continue to play a central role in our nation's and the international community's response, and we will continue to work multilaterally where possible and unilaterally when necessary to achieve our policy aims in the context of the historic changes sweeping the Arab world today and all other challenges we face in the future.